Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Big Picture with Frank Razan Pereira. On the lines of the Andhra Pradesh government, Haryana too has announced it wants 75% of private sector jobs in the state till a certain salary slab reserved for local candidates. In November 2020, the State Assembly passed the Haryana State Employment of Local Candidates Bill 2020, paving way for more employment opportunities for locals in the private sector. On March 2nd, the governor gave his assent to the bill. Haryana's new reservation law is taking work from home to the next level. Gurugram, which shares its border with New Delhi, is home to some of the biggest powerhouses in the sector like Google, Microsoft, TCS, Infosys, Wipro, HCL Technologies, and many more. The MNCs may be able to comply or find a loophole, but it is the local smaller players who are going to suffer the most. Haryana is not the first state to push for such a move. There are others who plan to do so in the near future as well. But all of them have run into hurdles of their own. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the issue of reservation in private jobs. Joining me on the program today are J. Sai Deepak, Advocate of the Supreme Court, Abhinav Prakash, Assistant Professor DU, and Manu Seth, former head of the APAC region of marketing for HTC, and he is also has his own startup now and is doing lots of other things as well. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me in this edition of the program. All right, so Sai Deepak, let me start the program with you. How would you look at the decision of, say, the Haryana government to go ahead with 75% reservation, in private jobs? There are other states who are likely to follow suit as well. So how much of an impact is this going to have, and how do you look at it from a legal perspective?
So, frankly speaking, for a government which comes from a certain dispensation that believes in greater national integration, at least on the face of it, I felt that this move is at loggerheads with the overall position of the party in power, so to speak. And second, 75%, frankly, goes beyond the 50% limit for any kind of reservation that the Supreme Court has laid down under any circumstances. Three, the idea should have been to perhaps equip people more in terms of skill sets, as opposed to making it mandatory on the part of private entities to earmark about 75% for local seats. I understand that it applies only to a certain category of private establishments. Legally, I certainly believe that the government is on a fairly weak footing. I don't see the kind of justification that has been marshaled, or what kind of evidence has been marshaled, what kind of baseline studies have been undertaken and carried out to support this. Because especially after Nagaraj and in light of the Supreme Court's verdict in the Maratha reservation case and so on and so forth, it makes it very, very difficult for the government to come out with some kind of an arbitrary position. This is, for all practical purposes, going to be viewed as a populist political decision, as opposed to a decision that is necessarily warranted. And I'm not even sure what kind of discussions were undertaken with private entities to address their legitimate concerns with respect to efficiency, sourcing of talent from that particular part of the state or that particular part of the country. Honestly, I don't think the government will be able to survive a withering scrutiny by the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. Manu Seth, let me bring you in now, since you are here. You've been at the helm at multinational companies. You've also run startups, running smaller companies as well. So how would you look at this decision? How does it impact a private organization? How does it impact a recruiter, say, to speak? Because, you're looking at a very limited pool to choose from.
Correct, Frank. So first, Frank, I'll congratulate for the edition of Big Picture under Bharat First umbrella. That's great initiative, and that's a very nice topic we have picked up. So a few things which I would like to highlight under that umbrella we should look at. One, we should not look at in terms of the number percentage game, which is like being initiated by various governments. Rather, it should have been looked in a perspective that how it is going to contribute towards the economy of the state, the overall economy of the country, where the year which has passed by has not been great for anyone. it has been a great tough time, whether it has been from a government perspective, PSUs or the private jobs. Second point is that it's really have to be channelized and executed well in terms of the skilled manpower and the categories of the manpower. Because if we look at various states, there are a lot of people, there's a lot of migrant population from certain set of states which are working in 7 to 8, 9 urban metro markets or the top 1 to 3 markets. And how it is really driving the revenue for that state, because people are working there but they are taking care of their families, which is at the back end. So it has to be looked at from a perspective that how and whether it is really going to help that state for generating more economy, for generating more empowerment, or is it really leveraging the schemes which is being laid by the center under the MSME schemes or the overall lot of initiatives like ODOPs and other initiatives to enhance the industry and the growth. So it looks, on the look of it, it just looks like a number game where we are trying to ramp up the number as a percentage, but it doesn't look like that it will really help the local talent even, or the local revenue, or whether it is in a form of a tax collection or a GST collection or a state tax component collection. I think there has to be more policies which needs to be redefined in laying out the execution of that overall umbrella. That's my take.
Absolutely. Abhinav, let me bring you in now. You've heard both the panelists before you. Let's look at it from an economic and from a development perspective. How much of an impact is this going to have? Is this really going to move towards development, and is it going to help the economy, or is it going to be counterproductive?
Well, yes, Frank, thanks for having me on the first show of the Bharat First. So, and congratulations for the new initiative. See, I think first question we need to ask is that what is the basis on which this decision was taken? Where is the white paper? What is the percentage of non-locals employed in the Haryana or the Jharkhand? What are their skill sets? What exactly is the cost of shifting from, let's say, the migrant workforce to the local workforce? So we just don't know what is the basis of this decision. Why only 75%? Why only 50,000 in the case of Haryana? Or why 30,000 the limit of the income? So I think this is a very arbitrary decision. We don't know what it is based on, because if you look at the last census, which is 2011, the migrant workforce constitutes only 8% of the urban workforce, and much of that is basically intrastate migration. So basically, people from other parts of Haryana migrating to Gurugram constitutes the largest component of the migrant workforce in the Gurugram, and Jharkhand sadly does not have any such economic powerhouse. So my point is that it's an arbitrary decision. There is no basis of this decision. Other point is it ignores that the private industry and the urban centers depend a lot on the migrants. The migrants are not coming to the cities like Gurgaon because they are coming there to benefit of free ride on the prosperity. Migrants are the reason that you have the great centers of economic activity that emerge. Gurgaon was built by the migrants. There's no reason why Gurgaon grew except that when in the 90s, the Delhi started imposing rules and regulations, pushing out industries based on the environmental considerations, or started imposing residential norms and other things, that lots of this industry simply moved on the other side of the border to Gurgaon that was closer to the airport, and this is why Gurgaon grew. And when we talk about Haryana, the Gurgaon and surrounding regions are the major hub of the economic activity and the migrant workforce. So there is no locational advantage that there's in the terms of labor pool available in Haryana. The Gurugram was built because there was free mobility of labor, good, and capital. Other point, Frank, is that this law completely ignores the complex web of interdependence. The production chains today are very complex. So while Haryana might be the headquarter of a company, and there might be a factory in Faridabad, there might be a factory in some other district of Haryana, the supply chains will run across Noida, it will run across Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, and so on. So once you start restricting the markets and factor market in the sense that you're restricting the free movement of the labor, I think you are completely disrupting and sabotaging those quite complex, nuanced economic interlinkages, and that will have serious repercussions for the Haryana. In the case of Jharkhand, unfortunately, we don't have much private industry to speak of, so I think they are preempting the growth of private industry itself.
Absolutely. All right, Sai Deepak, let me bring you in now. I want to take two aspects forward with you. One, of course, if this goes to court, how much water is going to stand? Secondly, of course, let's talk about the other aspect that you touched upon in your opening remark. Here we have the government and others talking about how we should put up a united front. We are taking on the international media, the international community as well for showing us in bad light. And here you have state governments working in silos. So what kind of a message does that send out?
So I think I put out a slightly mischievous tweet where I said that this is Haryana government's interpretation of go vocal for local in a very parochial fashion, because I don't think this was what the Prime Minister Modi had intended in the first place. See, frankly speaking, there are 2 or 3 clear reasons as to why I would call into question its constitutionality. It's possible for the Haryana government to cite what the Andhra Pradesh government did in 2019 to say that if that has passed muster, why not this particular state government? The fact is, both these legislations and both these moves are under serious question, and neither move is actually an exception to the Indrasani judgment of the Supreme Court, where any kind of reservation, frankly speaking, cannot be over 50%. And this goes beyond Indrasani for the simple reason that Indrasani is largely a question of public employment. It's largely a question of state employment. Here, you're actually speaking of reservation in the realm of the private industry. It's almost as if the government has bureaucratized and created a license permit Raj for the HR departments of private entities. And the worst part is, assuming that it was limited to a particular sector where the government was clearly interested in cultivating some kind of homegrown skill set, so to speak, I would have expected them to say, this sector, we have certain strengths, or this is where we lack, and we wish to overcome this weakness by increasing local hirings in so and so manner. But if you look at the breadth of the legislation, it says any person employing more than 10% is within the ambit of this particular legislation. So if I happen to be a contractor of sorts who is actually helping in construction of buildings, I have to actually source locally, whether or not I have the people for it, whether or not I have the skill sets for it, and this effectively hands greater leverage to the workforce as opposed to the employer. And at a time when we are looking at labor reforms and these kind of issues to increase the manufacturing capacity of this country, you have handed more leverage to the employee simply because he happens to come from a certain place, not because he has better skill sets to offer on the table. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, I don't think, as Abhinav mentioned, that there is any kind of study whatsoever. There's a random statement made in the statement of objects and reasons that because there's been an influx of migrant population, this particular move has been necessitated. What is the role of the migrant population? Second, where does it say that a state government has the right to prevent the influx of migrant population? Is that our interpretation of the federal character of Bharat? That's a question that needs to be answered. Is that the manner in which we interpret federalism under the constitution? 2, from the standpoint of national integration, this is an increased siloization of Bharat, and now at a very, very critical level, because while on the face of it, it may seem that jobs under 50,000 really don't matter, that is the huge chunk of the job sector, according to me. There's a huge population that's actually vying for that kind of or let's say employment. So I think even if it is capped at 75%, the fact that it is limited to 50,000 means a large swathe of jobs which are available for a lot of low middle class people and middle class people are out of the scope of availability merely because they happen to come from some other part of the country. I don't think this can even pass scrutiny. If the Supreme Court's conduct on the farm laws is any indication of the extent to which it can go, I would suggest this is one of those legislations that must be stayed on day one if the Supreme Court is serious about it.
Absolutely. All right. So, Manoj, let's talk about another aspect now. The central government has been speaking about privatization. The government has opened up pretty much all sectors for the private sector to come in and contribute and, and do their bit. And on the other hand, you have state governments going ahead with such kind of laws. So what kind of a message does it send out to the private sector? What is it that the private sector looks at when, when they're planning to invest in a particular state? Do all these factors also matter?
It really matters a lot, Frank. Let's take an example like we mentioned about Jharkhand and Haryana in the coming times. But let's go back to Telangana and Maharashtra for a while. If you see a lot of international companies which brought the FDIs to the country in the segment of telecommunication or in the segment of the automobile, they have moved more towards Telangana as a belt rather than even UP as a belt. Now, of lately, we would see a lot of focus coming towards UP and Jaywar being the whole attraction around that. to your point, this does not send the right message, because when a private company set up an operation, they are looking at various levels and various scales of people and various skill set. And it is not necessary that all that skill set would be available in that particular state itself. So you have people coming from the different states. Like if we talk about IT as a segment, like you have Amazons and other folks sitting out in deep south, a lot of talent is from north or the west, which is working there. So there will be a different segmentation of the, I would say, the CTC segment, but it is not sending the right message. It is making things more complex, because as even Abhinav mentioned about supply chain and things around, it can't be limited. I think the best way would be to categorize as per the local skill set, because if you say that, okay, you want to generate employment and you want to hire people who are within the near vicinity and they have to work on the factory or on the machine or on the assembly line, for that segment, it may make sense. But for the middleman management or the other management, because a lot of controversy starts happening. People are not working like this. This is not working like this. So it is not sending a unified message. It's getting more complex. It is creating more challenges when people or the private organizations are looking in the form of their machinery setup as a factory, or the supply chain or the logistics, or even the movement of their delivery or the services. Like if you go to a service segment like Zomato, Swiggy, they are also attracting international investments as a private organization. But majority of the community and the people doing those deliveries are the migrant population. They're not the localites, like Uber or all those kind of services. So from a private company, it will create more complexities in the execution of their product or their services to the consumer or even to the government segment.
Absolutely right. So, Abhinav, let me take this particular aspect forward with you as well. The government has been working really hard to try and, climb up the ease of doing business index. We've been looking for FDIs really from all sectors. And, what kind of a message does something like this send out to potential investors who would like to invest in India? Because at the end of the day, they'll have to invest in some of these states.
Yes, I fully agree to that, Frank, because see, the government is trying to create one nation, one market. It is reforming the tax system. It is also reforming the labor laws, because remember, in India, the labor laws have been the bane of the industry. So we have recently codified our labor laws into 4 codes, and now again, this law comes in the realm of employment, which threatens to reverse the entire game, because you are now segmenting the labor market itself. The message it sends out is very clear, that Indian political class has no understanding of the urban economics, has no understanding of the economic growth, and just doesn't care about these third and the second order effect of the policies they make. So you look at this law of the, let's say the Haryana case, it confuses administrative geography with economic geography. Now, 14 out of 22 districts of Haryana are part of the NCR region, National Capital Region. So how can you be part of the NCR region and then restrict people coming from, let's say, Rajasthan or Noida or the Western UP coming into Haryana for your work? So it basically tells that the government, and especially the state governments, have very poor understanding of the polity, and which basically is, I think, which will threaten or which will scare away lots of investors, because they will try to now shift to Bangladesh, Vietnam, and it's already happening. So most of the investment going out of China is not coming to India, it's rather going to Thailand, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. Why? Because in India, the policy arbitrariness and uncertainty is a big deterrent for any serious economic investor to come into business in India. The other point is, Frank, which is also very important, it is also the reflection of the populism on the ground. Because see, providing reservations, providing this kind of representation should be done by the government in the government services. But what is happening over the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, that the vacancies in the government sectors are simply not being filled. Whether it's the center or the states, the situation in the state is really very bad. Now that is creating a huge pressure on the politicians to do something for the educated unemployed. And now you're not providing those reservations in the public sector because you are shutting them down, or you're simply not filling vacancies decades after decade. So now you're compensating that by imposing those criteria on the private sector. Private sector should not be doing all those things. If you want to create more jobs and employment, you should be increasing the growth of private sector. You should be focusing on economic growth rather than trying to redistribute the gains of the growth without having the growth itself. So I think this basically tells that policymaking in India suffers from arbitrariness and uncertainty, which is a very dangerous thing, Frank.
Certainly. All right, time to get closing comments now from all my panelists with the best way forward. Let's also look at another aspect, Sai Deepak. You know, what if, say, for instance, a state like Karnataka goes ahead with reservation in private jobs? What's going to happen to Silicon City? What's going to happen to all that IT workforce that we are all proud about?
I think the move of both the Andhra Pradesh government in 2019 and the Haryana government and the potential move of Jharkhand government has effectively pushed what I would call the reservation debate to a very real specter of religion-based or caste-based reservation in the private sector. That is perhaps the only thing that is left right now. Okay. And we have moved very close to that possibility at this stage. When Srimati Mayawati suggested this a couple of years ago, we were all up in arms saying, how can this happen? What can happen? And all that. I'm sorry to say, perhaps that was India's elitist mindset at play, because now that Haryana government is doing this, I don't see similar reactions coming from across the board. When it reflects, according to me, a certain degree of hypocrisy, that if an Uttar Pradesh were to do it under Mayawati, then there's a certain reaction. But if, let's say, a Haryana does it under BJP, then there's a different kind of reaction. I think that is actually putting on stark display our own elitism when it comes to these decisions. I don't think any government, any dispensation, or any politician should get a free pass, particularly at a time when we are trying to address a lot of identity related issues. And when identity meets economy or opportunity, that according to me is the perfect crucible for national disintegration. Because nothing matters more in today's day and age, apart from religion, is a question of opportunity. And to actually introduce this kind of move, I'm sorry to say the word that must be used is hyper regressive and nothing more. That's the word that I would use. When you're looking at removing the government from the business of business altogether, the government has entrenched itself in perhaps the most fundamental decision that an employer or an enterprise would make with respect to employment, human resource. That is something that the government had no business to meddle with, and certainly not to the degree of 75%.
Manu said?
Absolutely, I echo the same. We have larger issues to be handled, and it will not be taken in a positive note from the workforce and the employer's perspective, and it will rather be a more detrimental in the overall economic growth and many economic parameters where we have to work on, because we have larger challenges to catch up our economies, global. We're talking about global stage. We're talking about global manufacturing hub. That's where the time where a lot of people are diversifying towards manufacturing setup. And that's where the lower skill set people are required. So it has to be executed in a different perspective, not to that degree. And it should not get towards the lines of casteism and the locals to that level. It will really disintegrate the overall imagery as one India and one so-called, we said, Sone ki Chidi at one point of time.
Abhinav Prakash, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, I think I agree with what Sai Deepak and Manuji has said. This law will basically destroy the medium industry in Haryana. In Jharkhand, we don't have much industry because remember the MNCs can do the compliance, they can shift their workforce, they can relocate, they can open up a campus in UP, in Noida and shift their workforce there to bypass this law. But what about the medium scale industry in Haryana? The people who are running mills, cotton mills, the people who are running textile mills in Haryana, people who are running furniture manufacturing in Haryana, they are going to suffer from it because the labor cost will go up because now you can't bargain with the labor anymore. And see that the prosperity in Haryana is much higher, so the local labor will demand much higher wage than the migrant labor. So I think what we're looking at is a very serious impact, not on the MNCs on which the debate is centered. They will bypass it. Is the local industry of Haryana run by the Haryanvis which is going to suffer because of this law. So what can we do about it? I think it's very difficult to answer because once the decision has taken, we can only rely on two things. Number one, the Supreme Court here. And number two is that as it happens in India, the law will be diluted to such an extent that it will become meaningless.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that the move is arbitrary and not a well thought out decision. There is no study to prove that this will be productive. The bigger multinationals will survive by either moving elsewhere or finding a way to bypass the law. It is the local small and medium players who will suffer the most. labor cost will go up and it will have an impact, a negative one on the economy. The move is against the idea of a united Bharata. Well, with that, it's a wrap. See you again next time. But before I leave, let me remind you to like and subscribe to Bharata First on YouTube and follow us on social media as well, which is on Twitter, Instagram, and other modes. Please spread the word.